Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Hopefully the sound is okay and you can all hear me well. So this is the 10th episode of this live stream series dedicated to classical keyboard music. And so for those of you that are joining us for the first time, just a recommendation for the sound. If you're alone, I would recommend you use headphones. The quality will probably be better. And if you're in a group, to use external speakers if at all possible. It's doing things live on Zoom is a challenge, particularly music. So those are usually the best conditions. And then just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I'll be doing, the idea is to perform a few works, but also to create a bit of a context around them by speaking about the composer, speaking about the works, and then maybe some interesting ideas relating to the works that you can then listen for as I play. So tonight I'm going to be playing and talking about Franz Liszt, the 19th century virtuoso pianist and composer and abbé. He received religious orders, minor orders later on in his life. Really a fascinating individual who had a very rich and relatively long life. Rather than going chronologically through his life, I'd just like to talk about maybe a few different aspects that I find interesting. So he was truly a 19th century musician, born in 1811, died in 1886. And he was the quintessential romantic pianist, virtuoso, composer, individual, almost like the archetype of what we imagine as the Romantic era pianist. And there are a few reasons for this. I would say the first is his deep dedication to ecstasy, to strong emotions elicited in the audience as he played. Hans Christian Andersen, who heard him perform, wrote saying that he was like a demon nailed to the instrument, but that later on in the program, his face would change. It would become noble and gracious, and he would have this feeling of this kind of like godlike aura. And so, in any case, there was definitely he created the atmosphere, the theatricality around the performance was very important for him, and there was even this kind of Listomania that existed. He was also very much a Byronic figure after Lord Byron, in that he traveled extensively. He was like a pilgrim traveling through Europe, and this kind of intellectual poet wanderer, very much part of the romantic era character and personality. He traveled, of course, because he was a virtuoso pianist, and he went as far east as Russia and north to Ireland and all throughout Europe, but also because he chose to live in various places. He lived he was born in Hungary, but near Austria. His first language was German. Then eventually he moved to Paris, learning French, lived in Switzerland and then Italy for a period. He was in Weimar, a very important period, and in Budapest, of course. And later on in his life, he was living between three cities. He had like a three-part life, he called it, traveling up to 4,000 miles a year. And this is in the early days of rail travel, living between Rome and Weimar and Budapest. So he was in high demand, constantly traveling around and being inspired by the natural beauty of places like Switzerland, but then, of course, the history of Rome and everything that Italy represented for a lot of these musicians. And the third thing I would say is the connection with a wide variety of artistic interests. So the interdisciplinary quality, the multidisciplinary quality of the Romantic period. He, in France, in Paris, he was part of the salon culture, and he met Chopin, of course, and Alcan, as well as Delacroix or Ary Scheffer, the painter, and Victor Hugo, Balzac. He was close with Lamartine, and and even kind of post-revolutionary figures and activists. So he was very much in this world, the cradle of creativity in Paris, of romantic life. And even from this time, he understood and believed that there was a deep connection among these arts, that there was this undercurrent of something mysterious that he was attracted to. He didn't just want to be a virtuoso pianist. He was a composer, but he also wrote, and he wanted to be seen, I think, as this poet intellectual. So you can see kind of how this 19th century romantic figure was created. Although in his early years, he was, of course, a prodigy, an incredible talent. He studied with Carl Czerny, so one of Beethoven's pupils, and he even met Beethoven before his death. Apparently, Beethoven gave him his blessing or something like that. He studied composition with Salieri. So he came from this Austro-German, Hungarian tradition. And as I mentioned, his first language was German and not Hungarian. The Hungarian thing came a little bit later, in that it was as Hungary was trying to separate from Austria, there was a lot of national fervor, and he came to represent that as well. He would go on stage in kind of traditional clothing for performances, and he would go into these gypsy encampments and hear their music and then adapt it for the piano in his Hungarian rhapsodies. But it's almost, for him at least, it's an invented folklore in that it's not his personal, that was not his background. His father worked at the Esterházy court, knew Joseph Haydn. So yes, truly a romantic individual. Next, I want to talk a little bit about what he did for the piano. So he truly revolutionized piano playing. The piano recital, even this idea of playing a solo piano recital, came and was developed by Liszt. Up until that point, it wasn't something that was common to have a solo instrument recital. The idea of one person playing a single instrument would be able to elicit enough attention from a public was kind of unheard of. The concerts then had a wide variety of things, some solo, chamber music, a concerto, and kind of random movements and an aria, things thrown around here and there, the public more or less paying attention. Now that's starting to shift. Now people are going to concerts to hear artists perform solo instruments, long programs. He played all of the repertoire from Bach to contemporary music, which was, Chopin and his own music. So in all of this often from memory. So it was absolutely incredible. And as I mentioned, he had that very strong conviction when he played, really bringing out the emotional content of the work and transmitting that to the public. He also turned the piano so that it would face at a right angle, the lid being open to the audience, which was something new. And all of this was happening at the same time as the piano was really being developed, and a lot of mechanical inventions, as well as just a much sturdier instrument. The instrument of a few years before was like these relatively fragile Pleyel pianos that Chopin really liked and that were perfect for the salon setting, but really didn't have the volume for a larger concert hall. So it's during Liszt's lifetime that the piano really changed quite significantly. First with these Erard pianos that had this double escapement action that made you able to play repeated notes much faster, and also the volume. The piano was bigger, extended octaves. They were starting to use other stronger materials so that would resist the tension of the strings, and of course then you get more volume. And then eventually in the 1850s we start getting Bechsteins and Steinways and pianos that start resembling what we have today. Once we get to the late 19th century, those pianos are basically what we have now. There are a few differences, but more or less the same. But if we compare the beginning of the 19th century to the end, there are huge transformations. And Liszt was the perfect person to take advantage of these. He was incredibly creative in his search for coloristic effects in the piano that it would then resemble the entire orchestra. So he was able to take advantage of that and really bring out all of those qualities, and expand the palette of sound possible. And of course, the orchestra was getting bigger and bigger. I mean, we're already, when we get to 1860, these huge Wagnerian orchestras, which have nothing to do with those smaller orchestras of Beethoven or Haydn. And so this is the world that Liszt lives in. This is Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique. You know, this is completely different from anything that came before. So the piano playing then, of course, resembled those changes as well. And of course, technically, there were many, many things that he kind of started to do that would change piano technique forever. And to this day, we owe him so much. He taught also a tremendous amount. He was really loved by his students, and he was incredibly generous. Later in life, he didn't charge for lessons. He taught completely free. He saw it as kind of a donation to the altar of music, that this was his duty. This was his calling to transmit these things. And surprisingly, he has this tendency. People think, oh, it's just technique, it's just whatever. But he didn't teach that. He told his students, wash your dirty laundry at home. When you come here, I expect, a certain level of perfection. He didn't want to deal with those technical issues. He didn't have a methodical way of teaching. It was about music. It was about inspiration. It was about sound and color and phrasing and all of these things. So very, very dedicated teacher as well. Now just a few words about Liszt as a composer and as a transcriber. Liszt was dedicated to the composers that came before him, but also was constantly looking towards the future and thinking about progress in music. And what's interesting is that in the 1850s, there was what they called the War of the Romantics, where you had on one side the conservatives, Mendelssohn, and Brahms, Schumann to a certain extent, based in Leipzig, and then the progressive composers, Liszt, Berlioz, and Wagner, of course, based more in Weimar. And they had conflicting beliefs about what music should be and which direction music should take. A few of the main things, so probably the principal issue was structure and form. The conservatives wanted to retain those same structures that the Viennese that was used during Viennese classicism, principally the sonata form. That was really their main, one of their main arguments, that we need to retain these structures because this is something that was created, that was perfected. We need that balance, that rigor. Of course, they would broaden it, but still very much in that tradition. Liszt, of course, wanted to do away with that to a certain extent. For him, it was new wine needs new bottles. So we need a form that resembles the music that we are writing today, the music of our time. And what that meant was music that we would call now more organic, in that it follows maybe a more natural arc, a narrative arc, let's say, of transformation of themes, rather than having these strict formal divisions that are following a plan, but that the form comes from the piece, the nature of the piece, rather than something imposed upon it. Another important source of conflict was program music versus absolute music. So program music, of course, being music that's based on extra musical ideas, whether that's a poem or a novel or a myth or a biblical story or a landscape. Those all things outside of music that inspire the composer, inspire the composition. Absolute music being music that is just music, that doesn't have a defined source of not even inspiration, but a defined program. Some would argue all music is program music. How can you truly not have an intention? An intention maybe is a program. But in any case, for them, there was this clear distinction. Liszt, of course, wrote a lot of program music. The second piece you'll hear tonight, after a reading of Dante, is based on the Divine Comedy. But there are many, many examples that he uses of using heroes in his tone poems, for example. Figures like Mazeppa that occur, that he uses as inspiration for his works, or biblical stories, or poetry and things like that. So that's another issue between those groups. And we know Liszt was closely associated with Wagner, not at the end of Wagner's life, but earlier on. Liszt's daughter actually ended up marrying Wagner. Liszt was against it. And Wagner was somewhat critical of Liszt at times, but Liszt supported Wagner when he was younger, even financially, and he did believe in this idea of music of the future, whether that's thinking in a tonal way of expanding harmony, or even just the role of music as this kind of spiritual endeavor. And finally, just about the transcription. So the first piece that you will hear is a transcription of Wagner. Liszt transcribed a tremendous amount of music. He transcribed all 9 Beethoven symphonies for solo piano, every single one, including the 9th. So it's about 50 or so minutes of transcription, taking this symphonic music and turning it into solo piano music. Maybe that in theory sounds easy, but it's incredibly complex. First, you have to just even be able to read these scores before you can imagine translating that and transcribing that into solo piano music. So that's one example. Of course, the Schubert songs that he transcribed so well with such skill for solo piano. Then there are also examples of paraphrases or fantasies on themes of, where he would take themes from an opera, write kind of a work inspired by that, and then transcriptions of Wagner's operas. So there's the Tannhauser Overture, there is one from Parsifal, from The Flying Dutchman, and the one you'll hear tonight is Isolde's Liebestod, the Love Death, the final aria from Tristan and Isolde. So just to give you a quick background, Tristan and Isolde in 1 minute. The story is they start on a ship. This is the ship of King Mark. King Mark is Tristan's uncle, and King Mark is going to be marrying Isolde. Isolde lets it know that she hates Tristan. She hates this whole situation. She wants the ship to crash. She wants to kill Tristan, who murdered her fiancé. And that is then how she ended up being promised to King Mark against her will. So she asks her maid servant to, she's also kind of magical, and to come up with a poison to kill Tristan. Instead, she concocts this love potion, and they both fall deeply in love. And so then they have this deep craving, and it's really uncontrollable. And when they get on land, they have to hide, and they can only see each other in the evenings. That's when their love can truly blossom. And during the day, they have to hide. They're eventually found out. Tristan is wounded. He doesn't even defend himself in the duel. He's wounded. They bring him back to his castle in Brittany to heal or die or whatever, and he's in extreme pain, the physical pain, but even more so the emotional pain, the yearning of having lost Isolde, of missing her, of craving for her, for this incredible desire. She eventually arrives as he dies, and she sings this final aria, and this aria of transformation, actually, and she then collapses on top of him, thus the love death, which is a common theme throughout literature. But here it's a little bit different. So Wagner was reading Schopenhauer, The World is Will and Representation, where the basic idea is we are all just kind of pushed by the will, this never-ending, clinging, driving force, this yearning. And the problem is that it's never truly satisfied. We're never truly fulfilled. We never reach that sense of fulfillment. There's always that gap between that craving, that desire, and that feeling of fulfillment. When we get something, we just want more and more constantly. For Schopenhauer, the only way out is renunciation. And that would be the message in Wagner's final opera, Parsifal. But still at this point for Wagner, it's actually love is the redeeming quality. Love can redeem us. So this is what we see in Tristan, the yearning, the pain of that clinging, of that yearning. And for Wagner at this point, the only cure is death. But it's not death in a sad way, it's death in a happy way, in that this is the only way that their love can exist. This is the love that exists past death. And this is why Isolde is almost ecstatic during this final aria. And this is the moment in the opera too, where where everything is resolved harmonically. If you know I'm sure you've heard the prelude. So already from the beginning, there's this yearning of that half-step motive and that tension of this Tristan chord. If you want to impress someone, you can talk to them about the Tristan chord. It's at the end of the opera, finally, that we get this sense of resolution as they both die. So this is not a sad aria. This is kind of she's speaking about his transformation actually, and how they will kind of meet again or something in this other wonderful world. All right, so Wagner, transcribed by Liszt, Isolde's Love Death. All right. So you can hear all of those orchestral colors, the tremolos, kind of resembling the strings, and then of course this beautiful aria, this beautiful melodic line above it. I always imagine Jesse Norman singing it, I think, because I've seen that production so many times. Okay, now the second piece, as I mentioned, is the after a reading of Dante. So the French title, Après une lecture de Dante. And in French they say Dante instead of Dante. I'm not totally sure why. Anyhow, the second part of the title is Fantasia Quasi Sonata. And so this is part of the Years of Pilgrimage. So Liszt wrote a few volumes of pieces that are titled The Years of Pilgrimage, the first dedicated to Switzerland. And the Swiss pieces are really based on the natural beauty of Switzerland. So it's like lakes and mountains and things like that. Whereas the Italy album is really based much more on artists. So the first piece is Sposalizio, the painting of Raphael. The second, Il Penseroso, the sculpture of Michelangelo. Then there are the Petrarch sonnets. And then finally the Dante sonata, which is inspired by the Divine Comedy. And Italy, for Liszt, for a lot of these artists, was this promised land. It was this artistic mecca. It was the cradle of Western civilization, antiquity and modernity and beauty, poetry. Also, there was the French Academy, so there were many French artists that were working there at the same time as Liszt. So he had this very, very strong community, and it was a place of great inspiration. There is, of course, the spiritual aspect. Liszt was a devout Catholic, and he became friendly with Pope Pius IX over a shared love of music. He lived in the Vatican for a period of time. So these were the kind of circles that he moved in. He eventually received minor orders in the Catholic Church and was known as Abbé Liszt later on in life. So this was a period of incredible inspiration that he would carry with him. So specifically about this work, so of course it's inspired by Dante, but it's not like a kind of verse by verse, play by play of the work. It's much more Liszt's impression after having read the work. So you can't really find a clear progression, somewhat from like hell to purgatory to paradise. It's much more these varying scenes evocative of certain moments within the work. And there is precedent to this. Victor Hugo, in the collection of poems Les Voix Intérieures, has a poem titled Après une lecture de Dante. So Hugo had already written a poem in this similar kind of light, where it's after having read the work, his reaction, how that affected him then in the modern world. So this is that same general idea. Throughout the work, there are a few elements that you can listen for. So the first is what you'll hear in the beginning, in the introduction. This element will come back many, many, many times throughout the piece. It's a repeated note motive, and the interval is the tritone. So as you can hear, it's very dissonant. It creates this feeling of evil, of diabolical, and it's a descending pattern as well. So we can feel maybe we're descending into the depths of hell. Why not? But this tritone is famous in music. Of course, it's the Diabolus in Musica from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. At that time, music was a science in the sense that they believed consonant harmonies were natural, were something found in the natural world, and then dissonant would then be unnatural, and then, I guess, diabolical in a way. But they were forbidden, that is for sure. And so, being the romantic musician he was, this is exactly the direction that he goes, to explore the underworld. So that's an interval and a pattern, that repeated note that you will hear constantly. Another thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is the chromatic note theme. Chromatic meaning moving in half step up and down. That's a chromatic scale, and the chromatic theme here. You'll hear in many different iterations. And this chromaticism, what chromaticism does is it kind of destabilizes everything because we have no clear sense of tonic. We don't know really what key we're in. We're kind of going up, going down. We're lost. You know, this could be the lost souls in hell, wailing, screaming. And that's a theme that comes back many times. Something too important with Liszt and this idea of progress is thematic transformation. So he's going to use these same themes throughout the work, but they'll be surrounded by different things and they'll have different characters, different meanings. So you'll hear them throughout. There's another one, this is more of a chorale-like, has a chorale-like feel to it that'll come back many times. That's a chorale-like theme that you will hear. There's definitely a spiritual quality to this work as well, because we're dealing with matters of sin and salvation. So there is that quality. It's very orchestral, and I really, for Liszt, I try to think orchestra, think orchestral colors rather than just virtuosity. Of course there's virtuosity, and that's part of it too. It's exciting. Virtuosity is wonderful, but it has a purpose as well, not only to elicit an enthusiastic response from the audience, but because it's expressing something musical as well. All right, so you'll hear many different contrasting episodes and themes that are representing different qualities, different episodes within Dante's work. Okay, thank you very much for listening. If you'd like, we can do a quick Q&A if you have any questions, and you can type them into the chat, and that way I can answer them, or we can even have a little discussion.